We were led to believe that technological progress is a straight line, leading from the primitive steam engine to modern electric cars. We were lied to in school textbooks. We were lied to in university lectures. And they continue to lie right now, as you look at old black and white photographs from the late 19th century. Have you ever wondered why, in photographs of cities from that era, be it Paris, Buenos Aires, or old Moscow, the streets look cleaner, more technologically advanced, and more harmonious than 50 years later? Have you seen these trams? Huge, heavy metal carriages, packed with people, speeding along the rails. But look closer. Zoom in on the image. There are no horses harnessed in front. There are no clouds of steam or smoke, characteristic of coal-fired engines. And most terrifying for official historians, there are no wires. Above the streets, the sky is clear. There is none of that web of cables that entangled our cities in the 20th century. How do these multi-ton machines move? How do they move with such speed and smoothness if official science claims that the internal combustion engine was then in its infancy and electrification was only taking its timid first steps? Welcome to a reality that was stolen from us. Today, we will expose one of the most massive deceptions of the industrial era. We will talk about wireless trams and technologies that were destroyed for the sake of oil dependence. Official history tries to feed us ridiculous explanations. They will tell you that these are horse-drawn trams, simply with the horses temporarily unharnessed for the photo. Seriously? In photos where the tram is in motion, where the figures of passers-by are blurred, horses are also not visible. They simply aren't there. Another version from historians is pneumatic trams, running on compressed air or early experiments with batteries. Let's apply logic and elementary physics, about which academics prefer to remain silent. To move a carriage weighing 8 or 10 tons and transport it along a 20-kilometer route, colossal energy expenditure is required. Late 19th century batteries are lead-acid monsters with negligible capacity. If such a tram ran on batteries of that time, half of the carriage would be occupied by the batteries themselves, and charging time would exceed operating time threefold. This is economically unfeasible. It is technically absurd for mass transit. Nevertheless, archival data confirms wireless trams operated in hundreds of cities worldwide. Their schedules were tight, their routes were long. This was a well-established, working system, not isolated experiments by eccentric inventors. Now about pneumatics. Yes, there was Louis Makarsky's system, trams running on compressed air. They shove this technology in our faces as the only proof. But let's look at the numbers. For a pneumatic network to operate, giant compressor stations are needed, pressurizing to hundreds of atmospheres. Where are these stations on 19th century city maps? They are not there. To refill such a tram with air, it would have to stop every 3 to 4 kilometers. But according to chronicles, transport ran continuously throughout the city. Moreover, pneumatics are noisy. They hiss, releasing cold air and creating condensation and ice. However, memoirs of contemporaries describe the movement of these trams as surprisingly smooth and quiet. No hissing, no rattling, no smoke. So what powered these carriages? Why, in photographs of exhibitions in Paris or Chicago, do we see complex mechanisms that have no visible power source? We are approaching the most inconvenient question for modern energy. What if the rails were not just guides? What if the very infrastructure of cities of that time, inherited by us from a previous, more advanced civilization, was part of a gigantic energy system? Look at the construction of the rail track from those years. Why lay so much metal? Why such a deep foundation if it's just a road for wheels? Engineers of that time, whom we condescendingly consider naive, built with a margin of safety that would last for hundreds of years. Or were they simply restoring what was already there? There is a theory that the rails served as grounding or a return circuit, and energy was transmitted in a completely different way, which did not require burning hydrocarbons. We see photographs where trams have strange antennas or arcs not touching any wires. Officials will tell you it's just decoration or a lightning rod. A lightning rod on public transport, which travels among tall stone buildings. Are you laughing? These devices suspiciously resemble resonators. If we assume that the atmosphere of that time, or the very space of the cities, was saturated with atmospheric electricity, then the tram was simply a receiver of this energy. It floated in an energy stream, like a sailboat sails with the wind, for free, cleanly, silently. But this was a great hindrance to someone. Imagine a world where energy cannot be sold because it is everywhere. You cannot put a meter on the ether. You cannot monopolize atmospheric electricity. This is precisely why, at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, a strange, illogical substitution of technologies occurred. Suddenly, as if on command, wires began to be strung up in all major cities. The sky was covered with a copper mesh. Beautiful autonomous carriages were scrapped or defaced by welding current collectors onto them. We are told this was electrification. I assert that it was de-electrification. It was a step backward. We were switched from wireless technologies, accessible to everyone, to a wired dependence, control over which lies in the hands of a handful of bankers and industrialists. Look at the dates. The emergence of the Federal Reserve System, the flourishing of the Rockefeller Empire, the beginning of the oil rush, all coincide with the disappearance of wireless transport. This is not a coincidence. This is a cleanup. We promised to go underground. But before revealing the secrets of underground communications, let's take a close look at what lay directly beneath the feet of 19th century city dwellers. The answer to the mystery of wireless trams lies not only in the carriages themselves, but also in the roadbed, which, in its complexity, surpasses many modern highways. Official historians claim that a tram construction boom occurred in the late 19th century. Suddenly, as if by magic, thousands of kilometers of steel tracks began to be laid in hundreds of cities worldwide, from New Zealand to the Russian Empire. Consider the number: thousands of kilometers of high-quality steel. Here we encounter the first serious contradiction that shatters the official chronology. Let's turn to the metallurgy statistics of that time. We are told that industry was only transitioning from cast iron to steel, that the Bessemer process was just gaining momentum. Steel production was expensive, labor-intensive, and limited. Now compare this with photographs from those years. We see not just a couple of lines in the city center, we see total coverage of cities with a rail network. Rails stretch beyond the horizon. They are laid in residential areas, in industrial zones. They connect neighboring cities. Where did such a colossal amount of metal come from? If we believe official reports on factory productivity, producing such a volume of rails would have required decades of continuous operation of all the world's blast furnaces. But cities were covered with a network of tracks in 2 or 3 years. Mathematics is powerless here, if one relies on history textbooks. The only logical explanation is that these tracks were not produced in the 19th century. They were excavated. Look at photographs of the so-called construction of tram tracks in old cities. You will not see there the process of laying a base, gravel, or complex engineering calculations. You will see people with shovels, clearing away dirt and clay, revealing an already finished, perfectly even rail track. They are simply clearing the legacy of a previous civilization, which turned out to be buried under a layer of soil after a global catastrophe in the mid-19th century. This is why the track gauge worldwide has strangely unified standards, which were later frantically re-engineered to different, supposedly national sizes. The original network was a single, global system. Now let's return to the question of power. If there are no wires overhead, then did the energy come from below? Official science reluctantly admits the existence of so-called bottom contact current collection systems. We are told about Dolta, Diato, or stud contact technologies. Allegedly, there were metal contacts between the rails that supplied current only when a tram passed over them. We are told that this was unreliable, dangerous, susceptible to water and dirt, and therefore they were abandoned in favor of overhead wires. This is a lie, designed to conceal the true nature of the technology. Look at old engravings and photos of streets during rain. Trams are moving. Puddles everywhere. Dirt, horse manure. Yet the tram keeps going. If it were a primitive electrical contact system, as described in the patent offices of that time, any short circuit from water would have paralyzed movement. Therefore, the principle was different. The technology was contactless. Those very metal buttons or grooves between the rails, which we see in old photographs, were not simple contacts. These were induction coils or resonators embedded in the roadbed. The tram received energy via electromagnetic induction, exactly as your phone charges today from a wireless station. Only the scale was industrial. This explains the incredible smoothness of movement and the absence of heavy engines inside the carriages. The road itself was the engine. The carriage simply interacted with the field generated by the infrastructure. It was an ingenious system. No moving parts, no combustible fuel, no wire wear. But this system had one fatal flaw for the conquerors of the New World. Energy could not be metered for a specific consumer. One could not install a meter on each carriage if the field was uniform for the entire street. And here we approach the demographic paradox. Who rode in these trams? Look at panoramic photographs of cities. Wide avenues, majestic architecture, gigantic cathedrals, and emptiness. On the streets, there were rare passers-by, lonely carriages, and these huge, empty trams. Official data on the population of cities in the late 19th century are ludicrous compared to the scale of construction. Cities were built, or restored, with millions of inhabitants in mind, but tens of thousands lived in them. Why extend a complex transport network into areas where no one lives? Why launch routes with a 5-minute interval if there is no one to ride? The answer is frightening in its simplicity. The transport system operated in automatic mode. It was launched long before new settlers moved into these cities, our ancestors, who were brought to reclaim the ruins. Trams continued to run according to old programs, just as blood continues to circulate in a body that is in a coma. In the photos, we see not the triumph of 19th century technological progress, but the residual activity of a highly developed mechanism whose masters have disappeared. The people in the photos, those very builders in dirty robes and caps, look alien against the backdrop of ancient facades and high-tech transport. They are not building, they are operating something they cannot fully understand. They are adapting divine technologies to their primitive needs. It was during this period that mass reconstructions began. What is reconstruction in the understanding of the new authorities? It is simplification. Complex induction systems are torn out of the pavements because no one knows how to repair them. Instead of eternal wireless traction, ugly poles begin to be installed and copper wires are strung. This is not progress, it is degradation. It is an attempt to power a complex computer with a dynamo and 2 wires. But there were also those who understood how it worked. Renegade engineers, whose names are erased from history, or representatives of the elite who seized power after the catastrophe. They knew that free energy was a threat to their control. Therefore, the destruction of wireless transport proceeded in parallel with the creation of fossil fuel energy. They needed to sell us a resource. If a tram moves by itself, receiving energy from the ground, you cannot earn billions from that. If a tram is tied to a wire that goes to a power plant burning coal or oil, you get an eternal slave and an eternal payer. If we stop looking down at the rails and raise our gaze higher to the roofs of these mysterious machines, an even more shocking discovery awaits us. Official drawings and museum plaques assure us that the strange structures on top of old trams are merely ventilation elements, decorative urns, or primitive lightning rods. But let's apply the critical thinking of an engineer, not a tourist. Why would urban transport, moving within the stone canyons of streets, need such complex and massive lightning rods? And why is the ventilation designed in the form of spirals, spheres, and intricate grills that exactly replicate the schematics of induction coils and resonant circuits? Look at photographs of late 19th century trams. On their roofs, we see entire laboratory complexes. This is not decoration. These are functional units. These bumps, crests, and bowls are receiving antennas and capacitors for etheric energy. If we assume that the atmosphere of that time was saturated with static electricity or a specially modulated field, then the tram was not a carriage with an engine, but a mobile resonator. It didn't need wires, because it was itself part of a circuit, completing the loop between the ionosphere, or emitters on towers, and the Earth via the rails. This explains one of the main oddities of the early tram: the absence of a visible power unit. Where is the engine? Where are the huge steam boilers or battery packs capable of pulling 10 tons of steel? They are not there. The bogies under the carriages look too delicate and light to house powerful electric motors of the 1890s. The answer is simple. The body itself was the engine. The entire carriage acted as an induction coil, creating thrust by interacting with an external field. We are looking at Tesla's technologies implemented in metal, but we have been made to believe that it's just a beautiful carriage. Now let's turn our attention to the motorman's position. And here, the official version begins to fall apart. In the earliest, unretouched photographs, we see a disturbing detail. The driver's cabin is often simply absent. There is an open platform exposed to all winds. Can you imagine a person working on such a platform in -20 degrees for 12 hours a day? Without glass, without heating, standing on their feet? This is physically impossible. A person would die of hypothermia or pneumonia within a week. However, in the photos, we see brave people in uniform standing by strange levers, seemingly bolted on at the very last moment. These controls, crude handles, huge wheels, primitive switches, look like alien growths on the perfectly designed body of the tram. This is evidence of the hack. Initially, these vehicles were autonomous. They were the drones of the past. The system operated automatically, obeying the unified rhythm of the urban network. Trams stopped and accelerated on their own, responding to field signals. When the new masters of life seized the cities, they could not restore the central control processor. They had to switch the system to manual mode. They barbarically cut mechanical brakes and rheostats into the complex electronic core, moved the controls to open platforms, and placed a bio-robot, a human, there. Later, realizing that drivers were simply freezing, they hastily glazed these platforms, creating those angular, ugly cabins that so dissonate with the elegant design of the main saloon. We see traces of makeshift conversion of a high-tech device for primitive needs. Another fact that puzzles physicists is the double-decker trams, so-called imperials. There were a huge number of them. Imagine a narrow gauge, often less than a meter wide, and on this narrow base stands a tall, heavy machine with dozens of people sitting on its second floor. According to the laws of physics, the center of gravity of such a carriage is critically high. At any turn, with any side wind, it should immediately overturn. But they rode. They rode quickly and smoothly. Officials mumble something about a heavy bottom and ballast. But to compensate for the weight of passengers on the second floor, the bottom would have to be cast entirely from lead, which would make the tram unliftable. The only technical solution that ensures the stability of such a structure is a gyroscope, a powerful flywheel stabilizer hidden in the platform. The gyroscopic effect kept the carriage vertical even on the sharpest turns. But a gyroscope is precision mechanics, requiring high revolutions and perfect balancing. Where did such technologies come from, in an era when, as we are told, the pinnacle of progress was a hay cart? We are dealing with technology that was ahead of its time. Silent running, absence of vibration, incredible smoothness of braking. All of this is described by eyewitnesses in their diaries. They were amazed that the tram stopped dead in its tracks, yet passengers didn't fall over. This is impossible with mechanical brake shoes. It is only possible with electromagnetic braking or gravitational inertia control. But the most terrifying thing is not that these technologies existed. The most terrifying thing is how quickly they disappeared. As if on command, a campaign of simplification began worldwide. Complex rooftop superstructures were cut off with oxyacetylene torches. Gyroscopes were removed and replaced with primitive suspensions, causing the carriages to shake and rattle. Automation was ripped out, root and branch. We were left with only an iron box, forced to be powered by a primitive wire. A technological lobotomy occurred. A smart, autonomous device was turned into a dumb, electrically powered trolley. And here the question of manufacturing arises. Where are the factories that made these masterpieces? We are shown photos of early 20th century workshops. Dirt, manual labor, wooden scaffolding. And you want to say that in these sheds they assembled perfect, sealed, all-metal bodies with complex geometry. Where are the giant casting molds? Where are the presses capable of bending such sheets of metal? In the photos, we only see repair and assembly from ready-made components. No one produced these trams in the 19th century. They were found preserved in warehouses. They were unpacked, adapted, had their logos applied, and were presented as new inventions. We are wearing the hand-me-downs of a great civilization. But even these hand-me-downs were too good for us, so they were deliberately spoiled, simplified, and in the end, destroyed. Because the existence of eternal transport, requiring no gasoline or spare parts, is a death sentence for the market economy. Let's uncover the scheme of how corporations destroyed this mode of transport, replacing it with smelly buses, and what the Great American Streetcar Scandal has to do with it. You will learn the names of those who deprived us of the future. We have reached the darkest and most cynical stage of this tragedy. If earlier we spoke about how ancient technologies were simplified and broken, now we will discuss their physical destruction. This was not the natural demise of obsolete transport. This was an execution. In the mid-20th century, throughout the world, as if by a single command from an invisible center, tram networks began to be massively destroyed. Historians call this the Great American Streetcar Scandal. But the scale of this crime extends far beyond the United States of America. This was a global cleanup, whose goal was to permanently hook humanity on oil and erase the memory of free energy. Imagine the scene. A perfectly functioning transport system that connects city centers with suburbs, doesn't pollute the air, and operates quietly and reliably. And suddenly, acquisition companies appear. Front companies, financed by giants like General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil, begin buying up tram depots. Why? To modernize them? No. They buy them to shut them down. Think about this absurdity. Capitalists spend millions not to develop an asset, but to liquidate it. This contradicts the laws of the market, unless the goal lies in another dimension, that of total control over resources. Immediately after the purchase, dismantling began. It resembled an invasion of barbarians. Carriages, many of which could have served for another half-century, were herded into giant landfills. They were doused with gasoline and burned. You can find these chilling photographs. Tram cemeteries, mountains of mangled metal, skeletons stretching beyond the horizon. They were destroyed with a maniacal hatred, as if they were not machines, but living witnesses to a crime. Why weren't they melted down? Why weren't they sold to other countries? Because the principle itself had to be destroyed. People had to be shown, the era of electricity and rails is over. Now you will buy gasoline. Buses replaced the eternal trams. This was presented to us as progress. Buses are more maneuverable, newspaper headlines screamed. But let's face the truth. A 20th century bus is a smelly, rattling box whose service life is 5 times shorter than that of a tram. It needs tires, made by Firestone. It needs gasoline, sold by Standard Oil. It needs spare parts, manufactured by General Motors. The tram was economically disadvantageous to corporations precisely because of its reliability and independence from fuel. The wireless tram of the past was a catastrophe for bankers. It required almost nothing but track maintenance. And what was done with the tracks? This is the most interesting part of the charade. In most cities, the rails were not dismantled. That was too expensive and time-consuming. They were simply paved over with asphalt. We literally walk and drive over the bones of an old civilization. Beneath the layer of bitumen on the central streets of Moscow, New York, Paris, and Melbourne, a gigantic metal network still lies. These are millions of tons of high-quality steel, which functions as a shielding mesh. There is a theory that paving over the rails with asphalt also had an occult, or, if you will, a physical meaning. The rail network was a gigantic grounding circuit, part of a planetary energy system. By sealing it in a dielectric, asphalt, the new masters of the world broke the circuit. They shut down the cities. They turned an active, energy-giving environment into a passive, concrete desert. Cities stopped breathing the ether. This was the final stage of blocking. Look at old newsreels from those years. People went to rallies trying to protect their trams. They understood that their comfort was being taken away and a surrogate was being imposed. But no one listened to them. City mayors were bribed. The press was forced to remain silent or write commissioned articles about how trams hindered motorists. It was then that the myth was created that a personal car is freedom. What kind of freedom is it if you are obligated to pay for insurance, for gasoline, for repairs, for parking? You were driven into financial slavery, having been deprived of the free public transport of the gods. The irony of fate is that 100 years later, we are again trying to build light rail transport. We are again stringing wires, spending billions on something we already had, but in a much more perfect form. We are reinventing the wheel while looking at blueprints for a spaceship. But those old technologies are irrevocably lost. Engineers who knew the secrets of tuning resonant systems have disappeared. Documentation has been burned. Only photographs remain, and those very rails under the asphalt, which sometimes show through potholes in the roads, reminding us of whom we betrayed. We live in a world built on ruins that we ourselves cemented over. We breathe exhaust fumes, stand in traffic jams, and consider this normal. But somewhere deep in our genetic memory sits the feeling that everything should be different. That cities should be quiet, the air clean, and movement smooth and swift. The destruction of trams was not just a change in transport type. It was an operation to change our consciousness, to instill a consumer psychology instead of a creator psychology. We were forced to forget that energy can be a gift, not a commodity.